What's up, Digital Academy? I hope you're all having a good day. Let's check out this one. So yesterday I was watching, I broke down and got Disney Plus for Evie, and we were watching Sword in the Stone, a classic old movie. I didn't realize it was a Disney movie, but it is, I guess, or they bought it maybe. But anyways, got me all kind of back into thinking about the King Arthur legend, and you've heard of probably aspects of this, or maybe you've kind of went through a stage of being interested in this too, of interested in King Arthur and Merlin and Lancelot and Guinevere and Excalibur, the sword. Um, who is so pulleth, who so pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is a right wise king born of all England. Right, so that's the kind of premise of the cartoon. Sword of the Stone is that sword is stuck in a stone, and Arthur pulls it out, becomes King Arthur, blah blah blah. Right, so now it's interesting to think, is this Arthur's story is situated after the fall of the Roman Empire, but before the Enlightenment, in this long period of time called the Dark Ages, sometimes also called the Middle Ages, sometimes called medieval Europe. We're basically talking from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD. And sorry, Arthur obviously didn't live for 1,000 years. What I'm saying is he's kind of closer to the 500 AD part of that, the earlier part of the Dark Ages, I think. I'm sure they'll mention it.
Here lies Arthur, king who was and king who will be.
Will be.
So reads the inscription on King Arthur's gravestone in Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. Writing in the 15th century, Malory couldn't have known how prophetic this inscription would turn out to be. King Arthur has risen again and again in our collective
Oh, come on.
imagination, along
Sometimes it
with his
skips once
retinue
at the
of
beginning.
knights, Guinevere, the Round Table, Camelot, and of course, Excalibur. But where do these stories come from? And is there any truth to them? King Arthur, as we know him, is a creation of the later Middle Ages, but his legend actually has its roots in Celtic
Excalibur might be the most famous sword of all time. Legendary sword. That's interesting. I just paused over them saying that it actually has Celtic, Irish, kind of Celtic roots. That's interesting.
poetry from an earlier time, the Saxon invasions of Britain. After the Romans left Britain in 410 CE, Saxon invaders from what's now Germany and Denmark quickly capitalized on the vulnerability of the abandoned territory. The inhabitants
Okay, so they said what, 4600 or 460 CE Common Era, 80 and CE mean the same thing. Okay, so yeah, it's interesting because you think of Britain as Anglo-Saxon, but you don't think of it as there was Brits and Anglos and Saxons, and there were and Scots and Picts and Celts and all these tribes, right?
of Britain fought fiercely against the invaders through several centuries of turmoil. There are hardly any written records from this time, so it's difficult to reconstruct an accurate history.
Yeah, and that's
However,
another interesting point, right? Is like the history of, we know the most from the countries or from the areas in the world that mastered writing earliest. So like the Chinese, India, um, the Romans, some of the Egyptian, the Sumerian, and the places where they were recording things, right? So for example, we don't have a lot of written records of the Vikings when they were kind of at the height of being Vikings. A lot of what we know about them comes from writings of the kind of British monks that were terrified of these people that were invading, these invaders, right? So, anyways, history is dominated by people that can write better, and that's very true in terms of what cultures we know about. Okay, so holy rant much. Okay, let's keep going here.
surviving poetry from the era gives us some clues. One of the poems, the Gododin, contains the very first reference to Arthur, though Arthur himself doesn't actually appear in it. It
Huh.
says a different warrior, named Guarda, was skilled at slaying his enemies, but was no Arthur. That's not much to go on. But whoever this Arthur was, he must have been the gold standard of warriors. Whether he ruled anyone, or even lived at all, is unfortunately less clear. Despite this uncertainty, references to Arthur caught the attention of an aspiring historian hundreds of years later. In 1130, Geoffrey of Monmouth was a lowly cleric with grand ambitions. Using Celtic and Latin sources, he spent years creating a lengthy chronicle titled The History of the Kings of Britain. The centerpiece of this tome was King Arthur. History is a generous term for Geoffrey's account. Writing 600 years after the Saxon invasions, he cobbled together fragments of myth and poetry to compensate for the almost complete lack of official records. A few of his sources contained mentions of Arthur, and some others were realistic accounts of battles and places, but many featured mythic heroes fighting long odds with the help of magical swords and sorcery. Geoffrey blended them all. A magical sword called Califor and a Roman fortress called Caerleon appeared in his source material. So
close
Geoffrey's
to
Arthur
Camelot.
ruled from Caerleon and wielded Caliburnus, the Latin translation of Calfra. Geoffrey even added a wise counselor named Merlin, based on the Celtic bard Myrd, to Arthur's story. If Arthur did live,
Celtic.
he would likely have been a military leader, but a castle-bound king better fit Geoffrey's regal history. Geoffrey's chronicle got the attention he'd hoped for and was soon translated from Latin into French by the poet Wace around 1155 CE. Wace added another centerpiece of Arthurian lore to Geoffrey's sword, castle, and wizard, the Round Table. He wrote that Arthur had the table constructed so that all the guests in his court would be equally placed, and none could boast that he had the highest position at the table. After reading Wace's translation, another French poet, Chrétien de Troyes, wrote a series of romances that catapulted Arthur's story to fame. He introduced tales of individual knights like Lancelot and Gawain, and
Lancelot.
mixed elements of romance in with the adventurous. He conceived
Guinevere.
Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere's love triangle. In addition to interpersonal intrigue, he also introduced the Holy Grail. Chrétien probably based his Grail's powers on magical objects in Celtic mythology. He lived in the middle of the Crusades, and others imposed the preoccupations of the time on the Grail, casting it as a powerful relic from the crucifixion. Numerous adaptations in French and other languages followed from Chrétien's work. In the course of these retellings, Caerleon became Camelot,
Camelot.
and Caliburnus was rechristened Excalibur. In the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory synthesized these stories in Le Morte d'Arthur, the basis of many modern accounts of King Arthur. In the 1,000 years since Arthur first appeared in a Celtic poem, his story has transformed over and over to reflect the concerns of his chroniclers and their audiences. And we're still rewriting and adapting the legend today. Whether or not the man ever lived, loved, reigned, or adventured, it's undeniable that the character has achieved immortality. Do you enjoy sorting fact from fiction? If so, you're in the right place. Please subscribe to our channel, and if you'd like to help support...
So that's cool, man. And again, it bleeds back into the Dark Ages. So it back into that time where we don't know, and that's why it's so ripe for the blending of myth and history, and Arthur came to start to represent this ability of the Brits to fight off invaders, and this idea of Arthur coming back, and it's cool. It's interesting because it's so easy with things like this in mythology to just assume it's all just nonsense, but our ancestors certainly didn't think so. But anyways, the Arthurian legends, I've always thought it's cool. Yeah, it was always like uh, Lancelot and Arthur, and then Guinevere, they both were in love with, and and Excalibur, the magical sword, and then of course this video hardly even touched on Merlin, which might be the most interesting part of all of it. All right, hope that interested you for 5 minutes. Have a great day and stay cool. Cheers.